Hello and welcome to the book club of the podcast of the Lotus Eaters. This is our 21st episode, so we've been doing a fair bit of reading over this section. Today we're going to be discussing Michael Oakeshott's Rationalism in Politics. Published in 1962, it is perhaps the most influential essay in conservative political philosophy since the Second World War. It identifies a mode of thinking called rationalism and attributes to the rise of this force all of the negative developments in 20th century politics. A bold claim on the surface, but argued eloquently and forcefully by its author, a historian at Gonville and Caius, Cambridge, who eventually became Professor of Political Science at the LSE. I'm joined by Carl today, who is particularly fond, I gather, of the Oakeshottian philosophy.
Especially this perspective, I think that Oakeshott is really hitting on something that we don't notice because it's the waters in which we swim. And this deeply, I think it ties very directly to a lot of what Reflection on the French Revolution. Why have I forgotten Burke? That's it. I kept wanting to say Hume for some reason, but a lot of what Burke was saying in that as well. And I do genuinely think that this is something. I mean, he seems to predict the rise of Tony Blair, basically,
right? Okay,
because of this kind of rationalistic politics.
That's true.
I think he's right.
He definitely is in the Burkean tradition. I believe he quotes Burke once or twice in this piece as well.
He does. And Roger Scruton found him rather inscrutable, as it were, actually. He obviously was a conservative, but he never really pinned himself down to a political ideology or philosophy.
So together we're going to analyse this essay and we will argue, I suspect, over some of the more contentious claims. So is this essay the master key that unravels all progressive arguments, or the snobbish bloviation of a bygone relic of the aristocracy? Before we get into the full analysis, we're going to take you through the essay step by step and see what Oakeshott has to say, so we're not arguing about something that you might not know. So the essay is quite short. It's about 40 pages in our copy here. And
he wrote a lot of essays.
He did. They are very dense. You might think 40 pages, I can get through that in a lunch break, but there's quite a lot of food for thought. It's divided into 5 parts. It's very stylishly written with some excellent analogy and imagery woven into its construction. It's the sort of essay that I would argue you don't get nowadays.
It is definitely from a different time and place, isn't it?
There are also several classical quotes in French and Latin. The author does not insult your intelligence by translating these into English, but at points I rather wish he would.
Yes, well, I mean, I imagine in his day everyone learned French and Latin in school, but in our day they don't.
Exactly. And they certainly don't learn the fashionable quotes of Descartes in their original French.
No.
So in the first section, which I think is the strongest part of the essay, he identifies a particular way of thinking that he calls rationalism. He then goes on to describe the character of the rationalist, and there's a very clever little sleight of hand that's happened here, because they've started off by talking about a theory and immediately created a person to fit the theory. And yet I don't think it's entirely inaccurate. We're going to quote from the opening at length.
I suppose the way I looked at it is he's creating the ideal rationalist. So you'll get people who are adherents to certain aspects of rationalism as he lays it out, but are not the full spectrum. But you also will meet those people, especially on the internet, who are the full spectrum rationalists. And they're the I effing love science. Have you got a source for that crew? They're embarrassing. And Oakeshott has predicted them.
I think in this section as well, he emphasizes the universalism, uniformity, and perfection of the rationalist doctrine as well as its key features. And we've talked about those in terms of some progressive philosophies before, but we will go into more detail of what that means later. In the second part, he makes a key dichotomy between what he calls technical knowledge and practical knowledge. Now, he essentially takes the whole field of human knowledge, cuts it into, and says the rationalist only believes in technical knowledge and discards and ignores all practical knowledge.
And the question is epistemology here. How do we learn these things? How do we know these things? And the rationalist believes that learning is done purely through books, whereas the person who gains practical knowledge does it through doing. And I do think that there is something to that distinction.
I do think the distinction would be better made if it leaned more on theories of learning rather than a discussion of theory, but this is a point which we'll discuss at length later. In the third section, he discusses the rationalists' claim to the possibility of a perfectly technical and dispassionate set of rules for inquiry. So he describes this as a master science, a set of rules that govern all of the rules that you could possibly make and create, that determines the legitimacy or illegitimacy of all inquiry. And this is essentially the evolution of a scientific method. He discusses the philosophers briefly, he talks about Bacon and Descartes, and he comes out with the witty aphorism that modern rationalism emerges from an unskeptical belief in Bacon, Francis Bacon, and a misreading of Descartes. I found this quite an education in philosophy. I'm not a philosopher by training, but I had to certainly hit the books to get some depth into that. In the fourth of 5 segments, he discusses the dominance of rationalism in politics, and this is where we really move into where it's relevant for you and I. He talks about various philosophers who we've discussed before. Hayek, for example, he has a passage on Hayek.
Yeah.
Now, Hayek is, I think, well known. Have we done a book?
I haven't actually done a book club on him.
We have to.
Yeah, we will do. But I like Oakeshott's characterization of Hayek. I've got a quote here, in fact. A plan to resist all planning may be better than its opposite, but it belongs to the same style of politics.
Exactly. So he's arguing that by the time Hayek comes around, he's already been so undermined by this dominant mode of rationalist thinking that the best he can do is come up with, as you say, a plan to resist all planning.
Yeah, but he's so within the paradigm that it's impossible for him to even see the paradigm. You know, the boundaries of it are so far away from him, and he's a part of it.
He, in this section, goes deep into the idea of the politics of the book. So the new wave of politicians who emerge with no practical experience, but they have a book, whether it's Marx and Engels or Hayek or whoever else, and they get their instruction from that book. And he then uses that to explain that there's a sense of society losing its rhythm and continuity, because basically problems and crises get thrown up by wherever the eyes of the politicians are looking, the eye of Sauron, the eye of the media. And wherever it's looking, there is a problem that must be solved, which means there's this forever this discontinuous sense of life.
And I love the way he summarizes it. Politics becomes just a succession of crises as it lurches from crisis to crisis. Oh no, this, now this, now this. And that's exactly what we see in the media narrative on social media now.
There's always a new crisis. He uses the word climacterics as well, which is a great way of describing it. Like I say, pretty old-fashioned. He briefly runs through as well Machiavelli and Marx and Engels. He talks about the American pioneers and argues that they had a natural kind of rationalism. He refers to, I think it's John Adams' a famous quote where he says that, we have traditions, but we have to rummage around all of the other dusty papers to find them. But
he also points out that because of the circumstances they were in, they could be rationalistic, but that was always tempered with a necessary practical aspect. You know, there were frontiersmen constantly setting up settlements and laws and ways of doing things. So it didn't matter how rationalistic they became. They were always by necessity forced into a practical mode of politics. And that's what he thinks tempered them, is this new frontier.
Yes. He then talks about the rise of scientists in politics, and oh my goodness, that is prophetic. It's something which, to be fair, he is not alone in prophesying, but we can definitely see that this has come true when nowadays our country in a crisis and the COVID pandemic is essentially run by scientists.
Yes. I mean, he's so on the money here, and he's got a good reason as to why this has happened.
Yes, but I think we'll have to really get into the philosophy underpinning this before we can explain why we think he's right here. Finally, in the last section, he talks about education. He talks about the rising primacy of ideology amongst political thinkers, because he argues if you have no practical experience and you learn only from the book, then you may only access the ideological world. You can't form a politics of your own necessarily.
And because rationalism is the politics of the book, I love the way he frames it. The rationalist always has an ominous interest in education. And that's exactly how I feel about it when I see the left talking about education. It feels ominous. It's we're going to indoctrinate you. And he's completely correct on
we
that
have
as well.
the answers, it's just the execution of them. And we're going to take your children in order to execute them.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's pretty sinister.
It is.
And he talks about the entire subversion of education, so compellingly, in fact, that I referred to him in our V for Vendetta podcast. He had a beautiful little passage where he talks about the conservatives not perceiving that they have lost when the left perceives they have a victory.
Yeah.
And
The left is
especially in moral education.
the left is well aware that they're taking victories, but the Conservatives aren't even aware that they're losing.
That they're fighting a battle.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely, because the ground is not... The trouble is that the Conservatives have delineated such a narrow battleground that anything happening outside of that seems irrelevant to them, when in fact they're being thoroughly outflanked.
Which is ironic, given Conservatism is the philosophy of continuity and time. You know, they've got a very, it's right up against their noses that they're looking at when it's, well, who are you allowing to educate your children? Don't you think that matters for the future? You think everything else matters for the future, but not the education of your children? That's a strange perspective.
I think so too. So that's a brief summary of the different sections of rationalism in politics. I thought we would quote extensively from the opening just so that you can get a feel for the tenor of the argument. And I think this is particularly important for Oakeshott because his entire argument is against the reduction of verbiage to technique and principle.
Yes.
So it would be rather disingenuous to reduce his essay to technique and principle. I think to get a feel for it, you have to quote from it extensively.
I agree, but it's going to be hard for us not to do that. That's the problem.
Yes. But I think if we quote enough from the beginning, then you will get enough of a feel from it that you'll forgive our abbreviations later on. So I'll start with the very beginning of the essay. The object of this essay is to consider the character and pedigree of the most remarkable intellectual fashion of post-Renaissance Europe. The rationalism with which I am concerned is modern rationalism. No doubt its surface reflects the light of rationalisms of a more distant past, but in its depth there is a quality exclusively its own. And it is this quality that I propose to consider, and to consider mainly in its impact upon European politics. What I call rationalism in politics is not, of course, the only, and it is certainly not the most fruitful fashion in modern European political thinking. But it is a strong and lively manner of thinking which, finding support in its filiation with so much else that is strong in the intellectual composition of contemporary Europe, has come to colour the ideas not merely of one, but of all political persuasions, and to flow over every party line. By one road or another, by conviction, by its supposed inevitability, by its alleged success, or even quite unreflectively, almost all politics today have become rationalist or near rationalist. Now, I would say that's quite a grand statement. What would you say?
I would say it explains why the Conservatives are the whipping boys of the Labour Party. Because they are trapped with they're not conservative, and everyone says this and not just because in the things they do, in the way they think. You know, they think in Blair's paradigm, and so they're continuing on Blair's paradigm. But Blair's paradigm was an arch rationalist paradigm. We can use the sovereignty of technique, as Oakeshott would say it, to fix the country, to remake the country, and of course that means making it in the mold of the United States or the European Union, which are also rationalistic endeavours. But Britain, and England particularly, is not a rationalistic endeavour.
Right.
It's a very intuitive and old and settled endeavour, as Burke would put it. And so I think that what he's doing there is explaining why the Conservatives are constantly doing progressive things. You know, what are they progressing to? You're meant to be conservative. You're not meant to be changing anything. You know, you're meant to be preserving this world.
So he then proceeds to discuss the proposed philosophy of rationalism by creating a character, the rationalist, who is described unflatteringly thus.
He is. And just to, again, point out, this is a device to show you the full spectrum of to carve out what this person is like. And in his day, I imagine it was more difficult to find individuals who are like that. But I can name a bunch of people who I think fulfill all of these aspects of this character. I suspect,
certainly in intellectual circles, there were a lot of people matching this description, and perhaps comparable to today.
Quite possibly, but like in regular life, I think. You know. But now, with the advent of the internet, you can find whole spheres of politics that are dedicated to creating rationalists.
That's true, but I think for me the more remarkable transformation is that the average person is more like the rationalist rather than the intellectual. True. I suspect perhaps, and as we'll see towards the end of our discussion, the intellectuals are less rationalist now than they were in Oakeshott's day, but the common people, I feel, are far more rationalist. And you'll be able to understand that once we've gone through the full meat of his argument. So he continues. The general character and disposition of the rationalist are, I think, not difficult to identify. At bottom, he always stands, for independence of mind on all occasions, for thought free of obligation to any authority save the authority of reason. His circumstances in the modern world have made him contentious. He is the enemy of authority, of prejudice, of the merely traditional, customary, or habitual. His mental attitude is at once skeptical and optimistic. Skeptical, because there is no opinion, no habit, no belief, nothing so firmly rooted or so widely held that he hesitates to question it and to judge it by what he calls his reason. Optimistic, because the rationalist never doubts the power of his reason, when properly applied, to determine the worth of a thing, the truth of an opinion, or the propriety of an action. Moreover, he is fortified by a belief in a reason common to all mankind, a common power of rational consideration, which is the ground and inspiration of argument. He is something also of an individualist, finding it difficult to believe that anyone who can think honestly and clearly will think differently from himself.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is political correctness.
Mm-hmm.
This is how political correctness works. It is the weapon by which rationalist politics has conquered its opponents.
Mm-hmm.
If you think different, then you are thinking from a perspective of prejudice and bigotry, and these things are bad in his view. The Burkean conception of prejudice being the ready application of ancient wisdom has been completely undermined and subverted because it doesn't stand up to the immediate timeless, and this is another point of the rationalist. He doesn't exist in any particular time as far as Oakeshott's concerned, and I think he's right about that. And it's hard to describe it, but the immediate, the instant, and if it can't be justified in that way, then it can't be justified. And so, if it doesn't have rationalistic foundations, then it's illegitimate in the rationalist view.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very interesting analogy. It is true in political correctness that it does rather seem as if the truth has been decided and your job is just to receive its dissemination rather than to argue or to question or apply your own reason, because if your own reason were to disagree, then
you're wrong.
You're wrong. And
because we've defined ourselves as correct.
Exactly. And there it becomes an arbitrary power struggle.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.